Good afternoon. My name is Claire Miller, and on behalf of the Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries, welcome to this month's Lunch with the Libraries. It is our ongoing speaker series that spotlights the unique collections, pioneering initiatives, and outstanding staff of the Sheridan Libraries. We are happy that so many people are joining us today for this virtual discussion of Sir William Osler's books and the Tudor and Stuart Club. For this edition of Lunch with the Libraries, we will discuss the collection of one of the co-founders of Johns Hopkins Hospital, take a tour of the Tudor and Stuart Room in Gilman Hall, and visit the John Work Garret Library in the Evergreen Mansion. That is where the rarest materials in the club's collection reside. In the process, we'll consider the Society's current and future life as one of Hopkins' oldest scholarly and social organizations. Following the presentation, I encourage you to ask questions of our speaker in the chat room. We will do our best to respond to as many questions as we can. Formed in 1931, the Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries is one of the oldest university library support groups in the United States. We provide financial support and advocacy for the Sheridan Libraries and organize events like this one to bring members of the campus and the wider community to the libraries. The Friends include people like you, alumni, faculty, staff, students, parents, and community members. I encourage you to join us if you are not already a friend to help ensure that the libraries remain one of the university's strongest assets, the heart of the intellectual life at Hopkins. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Daniel T. McClurkin is the postdoctoral curatorial fellow of the Virginia Fox Stern Center for the History of the Book in the Renaissance at the Sheridan Libraries. He received his PhD from the Department of English at Johns Hopkins and works on early modern Ireland book history and settler colonialism. He is currently working on a project relating to the Carroll family and the Irish Catholic communities in 17th and 18th century Maryland. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us today.
Hi, my name is Daniel McClurkin, and I'm the postdoctoral fellow at the Virginia Fox Stern Center for the History of the Book in the Renaissance. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the Tudor and Stuart Society, this wonderful room, and its revitalization in the recent years. Now, the Tudor and Stuart Society, the Tudor and Stuart Club, when it was first founded, was founded by Sir William Osler in 1918 in honor of his late son, Edward Revere Osler, who died in World War I. Now, both Oslers were book collectors, and Sir William Osler, for those of you who didn't know, was one of the first founding doctors, the four founding doctors of the Hopkins Medical School and Hospital. He was an avid lover of all things humanities and believed very strongly in the connection between the medical sciences and the humanistic fields. And when he moved to Oxford to become the Regius Professor of Medicine in 1908, he decided that he needed to do something, not just with his books, not just with his desire to promote learning, but he wanted to do something to inspirit that collegiality he saw at Oxford and at Yale to Hopkins. At Yale in 1913, he was invited to give what was known as the Silliman Lecture in Medicine. And while he was there, he saw the Elizabethan Club. The Elizabethan Club being a endowed center club that has its own clubhouse, its own building, dedicated to the study of Elizabethan England, early modern English literature, and general love of scholarship and rare materials. While there, and at the clubhouse itself, he decided this was the perfect model for something at Johns Hopkins, and from there founded the Tudor and Stuart Club. The founding of the club was in 1918 proper, that's when the funds were distributed, but it didn't really start until 1923, when all of his books and Edward Revere Osler's books came to Johns Hopkins University. Those served and formed the nucleus of the collection itself. So when the books arrived at Hopkins, a space was needed for them. A number of spaces were requested, the very first one being a wing of what is now the Homewood Museum. That wasn't going to fly. So Gilman Hall was chosen, mostly because there were some English faculty members willing to be relocated to a different spot in the building. This room right here was originally 2 English faculty members' offices, and more faculty members down the hall's offices were, shall we say, requested for the use of the society, the club. I switch back and forth between society and club a lot only because its current iteration, the Tudor and Stuart Club, is the T&S Society. And in my head, I keep going back and forth between society and club. So forgive those stumbles. When I talk about the Tudor and Stuart, I'm talking about its entire 100-year history. Anyway, so this space became a reading room, a room for events. It became a sort of clubhouse, originally for undergraduates, although in its later years for graduates and now almost exclusively for graduate students and faculty. The undergraduates would come in here, read material. They had their own reference library in the back there that took up 2 other rooms over in the corner. These bookshelves, I should say, originally held some of the, shall we say, important but not extremely valuable, extremely rare books in the collection. And in the corner, in the false wall, in the safe back there, is where the real treasures were kept. So the rare books, the rarest of the material, originally was kept here. Well, not literally here. This is our blackboard that we use sometimes for classes and events. But instead, behind this false paneled door and within the safe. Now the safe has been here since the room was renovated and originally kept some of the rarest materials that we're going to see in a little bit, currently stored at the Evergreen Mansion in the Garret family's library. This space didn't just hold books, though. To the horror of many librarians, the club's pantry was also right here before the technical setup. So cured meats, liquor, and cigars were stored in here. Indeed, one of the moments where the club began to, shall we say, lose the interest of undergrads is when the university could no longer offer them cigars and brandy. Indeed, there's a number of dean memos that go back and forth saying, what are we going to do? The undergrads are not interested anymore. There's no more brandy. Now, to give a sense of what Sir William Osler intended with this society, what he wanted this club to be, what he wanted this collection to be, I'd like to read you something from Dr. Rainey, the librarian at the time of Johns Hopkins, who went to visit Sir William Osler only a few months before his death in Oxford. He was the Regis Professor of Medicine at the time, Sir William Osler was, and his house was sort of a gathering area for all the American scholars who would come to Oxford for whatever their reasons may be. Now, Dr. Rainey recounts this experience going to see Sir William Osler and asking him about the society, the club. Rainey says, "From beginning to end, he impressed upon me that his earnest and supreme desire was to provide a place away from classrooms and offices where students, particularly collegiate students, could meet book-loving members of the faculty and others of like mind on equal footing to learn and share the delights of literature, to prove a chief comfort and uplift in later years. At the front gate, he came back to his main theme. He said, 'Tell them that it is in the babes, not the graybeards, that I am interested in.'" Now, the keen-eyed among you might have noticed that there aren't any books in the safe in Gilman Hall. They have to live somewhere, and so the rarest and the most important of them have come to live here in the John Work Garret Library of the Evergreen Mansion, and that's where we're at now. And most of them actually live right here in what's known as Sea Grill, what we call Bards and Birds. This is where Shakespeare lives, and this is where a lot of our natural history lives. Most importantly, these double elephant folio Audubon birds of America. Remarkable beasts in their own right, but not relevant to the T&S Society, the Tudor and Stuart Club today. Most of the Tudor and Stuart Club books are actually a little higher up, so I've chosen a few that I'd like to pull for you today and talk about in a little more depth to give a sense of the club. Like I said, most of these books have to do with early modern England, the English Renaissance, and the like. That was a favorite of not only Sir William Osler, but also his son, Edward Revere. This first book I'm pulling for you may be a small one, may seem a trifle, but it's quite important to the history of the club. And this next one I'm going to pull, and we'll talk about it a bit more in a moment, gives us a sense of what the club was doing and what its priorities were after Sir William Osler passed and the club went into the hands of the faculty and the students. So this right here, what we're going to start with, is the Golden Book of Marcus Aurelius, the English translation of it, translated in 1559. Before I continue, I know some of you have a concern that I might not have gloves on. We've not really used gloves in rare books and special collections for quite some time now. My hands are washed and dry. If you want a quick and sort of tactile explanation, think about the last time you tried to fish out a credit card with gloves on. It's a similar sensation when I'm trying to handle these books. So long as my hands are clean, the books are fine. The reason I chose this book is there's a few things of interest to us today. First of all, in the front here is ERO's, that's Edward Revere Osler's bookplate with Isaac Walton's initials down at the bottom there, Isaac Walton being the author of The Complete Angler, his first book and the thing that got him into the love of literature. Now, that bookplate is a lie in some ways, and I'll show you why it is in a moment. Here's the frontispiece, this remarkable little pocket edition of Marcus Aurelius, the English translation for easy and quick reference, still in the black letter font that we would expect of the 16th century in England, England being a long-time user of the black letter font, even after it had fallen out of use and popularity on the continent, other than Germany, of course. In the back of the book, we have a note. This is the primary reason I wanted to bring this up here, if I can find it for you all. Here we have a note from William Osler himself, and if I can read it for you here. This is the first book bought for Revere's memorial library, just the sort of thing he loved, W.O. So whenever owned by Edward Revere Osler himself, this book is, in a way, the beginning of the Tudor Stuart Club at Johns Hopkins University, and itself is one of the first books to arrive. Indeed, the Baltimore Sun did a write-up of the book when it came over here, announcing that a new edition sent by William Osler, who at that time was in Oxford, had come to Hopkins. The second book I have for you today is one that sort of speaks to the club itself after Sir William Osler. This is the 1590 edition of the Faerie Queene as it existed at the time. This is the first 3 books of the Faerie Queene. Remarkable for a few reasons. First of all, it points to the club's own collecting interests. With the endowment that Sir William Osler left now spitting out funds, the club decided, wisely so, to start collecting a single author, and this author they chose was Edmund Spenser, one of the most important authors of the English Renaissance, especially the 16th century, and his Faerie Queene being one of the most important books in the English canon, or the early modern English canon at the very least. Now this collection, which all lives over here, where I was just at in Seagrill, is essentially the complete works published during Spenser's lifetime, throughout the 17th century and in the early 18th century. And it's from these editions, of which changes were made both by well-meaning editors who were misguided in their changes, to sincere editors correcting small grammatical mistakes from Spenser. It's from these works that the Johns Hopkins University Press's Variorum edition of Spenser, an 8-volume set, which is still the scholarly standard. The citations are what you'll see most of the time in scholarly monographs. Those editions were made from the collection here at Johns Hopkins and of the Tudor and Stuart Club. What's most important about some of these early volumes of Spenser is that the books, this is one of the first 3 books, but the books of the Faerie Queene change later on. The ending cantos are different in these early editions than they will be in, say, a 1640, 1650 some edition later on there. So this book, with its cantos in which Spenser overseeing to a large degree the printing of, this book holds something closer to Spenser's original plan. Now, Spenser had intended to publish 12 books of the Faerie Queene. He doesn't quite get through 12, and his beginning here, his 12 moral virtues, remains in the frontispiece, this Icarus-like promise. What's also important to us today in this book is the book plate of the Tudor and Stuart Club here, the Tudor and Stuart Clubs of the Johns Hopkins University. The motto of the club being taken directly from Elizabeth I, Semper Eadem, or thus are always the same, thus it always is. Always the same, I think, is the standard, but always thus is how I've always thought of it. Anyway, that's the book. Now, the Tudor and Stuart Club in the 80s and 90s began to wane in membership, and indeed went into hibernation for quite some time, until recently. At its 100th year anniversary in 2023, the Tudor and Stuart Club was revived. It's a T&S Society, which I mentioned early on, and why I keep calling it the Tudor and Stuart Society or the T&S Club and switch back and forth. Now, the T&S Society is focused primarily on graduate students and is trying to keep the spirit of the original Tudor and Stuart Club without its exclusivity, without its clubbiness. The society, generously co-sponsored by both the Stern Center, the Virginia Fox Stern Center for the History of the Book and the Renaissance, and the Dean's Office, seeks to encourage a type of collegiality, conversation, society around the love of rare and early modern materials, early and pre-modern, that is. The lectures and events that are run through the T&S Society are all given by graduate students, all feature a reception at the end, and always have a book or two or a suite of materials from the Hopkins Rare Book Collection. The graduate students are able to present on the material, many of which go on to write articles and further scholarship on the material. Sometimes they end up being dissertation chapters. And after that show and tell, which takes place in the Maxey Seminar Room, we go up to Gilman 388, the Tudor and Stuart Room, and have some refreshments. The T&S Society also hosts lawn parties here, croquet on the lawns of Evergreen, and theater performances in the Box Theater whenever we can. So the T&S Society, the Tudor and Stuart Club, has what hopes to be and what looks to be a strong and promising future in Hopkins, if not in a slightly changed capacity from its early collecting days.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you. It's good to be with you today. Well, I guess I'm not seeing you so much as I'm just here with you. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and it's a pleasure to join you now live from the Evergreen Mansion in the office space of the Stern Center. As we switch our conversation from a recorded one to a more active Q&A, I invite you to ask any questions you might have, and I'll get them in the chat, and we'll go forward from there. I have a few materials at hand. If there's any questions about books themselves, I did bring the two books mentioned in the video here, and as well as a few other objects in the collections and things like that. So I'm happy to answer questions about physical materials as well. So I encourage you all to type your questions in the chat if you haven't already, and then I'll begin to get to them. Our first question, and I just want to start with this question from Cindy, who asks how many members the society has these days and how many people attend events. So we have 20 to 40 people for basically every event. There's kind of a stable of 20 people who attend most events, 15 to 20 who are really kind of ever present, who cycle in and out. But it depends on the event. Of course, one's love of literature and the history of the book can only go so far. If somebody doesn't really care about Italian material, and they might not go to see an event that focuses exclusively on Italian material, et cetera, et cetera. But our largest event that we had was our opening, which makes a lot of sense, our inaugural event, our relaunching of the T&S Society, which was last fall, which we had in the Evergreen Lounge, lawn, where we had croquet on the lawn. So we drank, we sort of got a history of the club. I sort of pulled out a larger range of materials. We showed off the Stern Center and showed people sort of the collecting interests of the club overall. So it was a wonderful event. That was 40 to 50. I mean, the numbers based on RSVPs and what we actually got are kind of hard to keep exact track on. And then about 20 per event. And I kind of know that it's almost always 20 or over because we start in the Maxi Room. That's where we have our sort of show and tell portion. And then we go to the Tudor Stuart Room in Gilman. And the Maxi Room comfortably fits 20, right? That's kind of its edge. Beyond that, we kind of get the crowd. And so because I always see a crowd beginning to form, I kind of am always very aware that there's about 20, if not a little more than 20 at those events. So that's the short of it. Bill asked kind of a question that follows from that I'm going to hop onto now is, sorry, Tony, not Bill. Sorry, Tony asked this question, some examples of past or upcoming events. So we started with this event on lawn, which is more inaugural, sort of like in the history of the club. Since then, we've had events on our collection of material related to Lord Byron, which is our sort of latest that we'd go. We have this wonderful collection of Byronia here at Hopkins, a presentation on Giambattista Vico's Scienza Nuova, really important 18th century Italian tract on the new science, as it were, presented by one of our fellows. Hopkins has one of three, maybe four, but I think it's only three copies of the Scienza Nuova that was annotated by Vico himself, right? And our edition has the most substantial notes that aren't just Vico adjusting grammar or sort of fixing printer errors before he gives the book to his friends, which is kind of a very common Renaissance adjustment, right? You very commonly see authors, before they give a copy to somebody, fix some issues of grammar or some mistakes. But our copy has actual notes and Vico sort of revising and reworking throughout. We had a Christmas event, where we presented some of our Frost Fair ephemera. The Thames used to freeze over, and when they would, there would be events, right, held like sort of a festival fair on the Thames, and they would bring out actual like printing presses where you could get little sheets of paper that said, I was here in, the year 16, et cetera, at the Frost Fair, and you get your name sort of put in. I mean, really kind of kitschy like and in contemporary terms, but we have a number of those Frost Fair ephemeral objects, and so Earl Haven's presented on those as sort of the theme of the hour. Because it was around Christmas time. Since then, we've had materials presented on our Mexican manuscripts that we have, which is sort of an interesting sort of bound collection of materials from Mexico. Since then, there's one of it. Presentation on the first folio, or their first folio, and really the first four folios of Shakespeare by a graduate student at Yale who came down, a member of the Elizabethan Club up there. And the other event that we had for these coming events was the Hamlet performance. One of the most interesting objects in our collection that's currently actually on Homewood campus, or I would have it for you here, is our Hamlet prompt book, right? Which is a 1676, I think. 1676 printing of a stage performance of Hamlet, right? With the company putting it on, marking what they excerpted. That was then later annotated by John Ward, I believe it was John Ward, but Ward, who was a sort of a great director and to call anyone in this period a director is misleading, but producer of plays at the very least. In 1740, he heavily annotated, right, this copy, and we performed the play according to his heavy annotations, right? So it's one of the more remarkable Hamlet prompt books that exists from the period. So we put on the performance of that. And upcoming, we have two other talks, one on a Greek author, sort of Greek art historian, if you will, in his later translations, and then ending up with Dante and sort of this issue of foraging women in the Renaissance. So that's what we've been doing, what we're doing, maybe a little bit long there, but to give you a good sense. Now on to Bill's question. So what happened to the endowment of the original club? So it got basically split up in a few different ways. All still according to Osler's wishes, right? But there's sort of a series of documents tracing this. There's still a fund for acquiring materials explicitly related to Tudor and Stuart England. That acquisition fund sets out a certain amount where we're able to buy a few books a year that kind of go into the club's collection. The rest of it went to the English department to help continue the facilitation of scholarly activities. It's not exclusively focused on the early modern period anymore, but still sort of serves as the locus of love of literature and this sort of this camaraderie that Sir William Osler intended with his original donation. So that actually funds the English department's Tudor Stuart Club lecture series, which is entirely separate from the club, but is still named after the club. And you'll have people talking about Shakespeare on to the latest, most contemporary Brazilian novelist, right? I mean, 2 years ago, we've had somebody talk about some Brazilian novels published in 1990, early 2000s. So really ranges there, but that's all within the Department of English, who also oversees the actual Tudor and Stuart Room now, the Tudor and Stuart Club Room. So there's also an endowed professorship currently held by Sharon Atchenstein and the Sir William Osler Professor of English Literature. So that's currently held by Sharon Atchenstein there. So that's kind of where the endowment has been kind of moved around. It still exists and is shooting out money in various capacities. I'm moving on sort of forward. Cindy had a second question. So is the library's collection of early modern English literature still growing? Yeah, so exactly as I said, yeah. Any recent acquisitions? We are constantly acquiring early modern materials in particular. I don't have a sense of exactly what has been bought with Tudor and Stuart Club funds, right? Since the acquisitions of those materials, it is kind of brought, there's money set aside explicitly for Tudor and Stuart material, but we acquire Tudor and Stuart material anyways, and there's no direct acquisitions philosophy of the club right now, other than Tudor and Stuart sort of fulfilling the wishes of Sir William Osler. So that's kind of where we're at with collection right now. So I couldn't give you a great example of exactly what book has explicitly been purchased with that funds right now. I'm going to keep up with the chat for a moment so I don't just keep rambling in case there's been something here. Thank you. Yeah. Why was Spenser chosen over Shakespeare? Good question. It has a lot to do with what was available on the market. Yale at that time had sort of a really remarkable collection of Shakespeare quartos, and we were kind of past the era by the 1920s of the great sort of Shakespeare collecting. So Spenser became sort of a really obvious other place to go. They're kind of looking for an author. Spenser's interesting for a few reasons. Not only is he kind of just as important and kind of for a long, I don't want to get into sort of a fight with Shakespeareans here, but Spenser's import on English literature has been amongst authors, English authors in particular, unquestioned really since his publications, whereas Shakespeare kind of waned for a while and was in many ways sort of rediscovered by the Romantics, and the Shakespeare that we know today kind of reborn. So Spenser has a really kind of important place in English literature, but also, so part of it's like, what material could you acquire? You couldn't really acquire Shakespeare by the 1920s for a reasonable price if you wanted to. Spenser was just as important, and Spenser has an interesting publication history, right? What material of his is published and when. He was fairly present in the publishing of his objects. His later printers in the 17th century themselves had a really sort of active they were very interested in creating the cult of the arch poet Spenser, and so there were a lot of luxury editions, a lot of collected works, and so there's kind of an interesting story of publication, editing, re-editing that you could tell with Spenser. So I brought sort of this Matthew Lowndes 1609 copy here that is, 1590s when we get the first few books of the Faerie Queene published, and by 1609 we're already beginning to get these larger folio, there's actually a text, it doesn't really larger editions of Spenser coming out that begin to have these really wonderful frontispieces that are beginning to change. I mentioned in the video that the final few quartos of the Faerie Queene are changed by this time, or the third book of the Faerie Queene, excuse me. So we get these wonderful frontispieces, right? Things begin to get a little fancier. So makes a lot of sense there for Spenser. And then, of course, once you sort of begin to build this seed of a collection. It kind of has its own inertia to it, right? So it may keep adding and adding and adding. So that's more or less why Spenser was chosen. Yeah, Claire, follow-up question. Will there be an opportunity in public to view the Froster items? I mean, they're in the Hopkins collections. If you'd like to request them, they're always sort of potentially available. With the library needed to shut down, and its reading space is becoming a little more uh, or there's less reading spaces for rare materials with renovations happening, is what I really should say. The movement of these ephemeral objects, which are always a little bit harder to deal with than books, has become a bit of a question. We're hoping to have them out again. And again, we're really hoping to have an exhibition at some point of our ephemeral Renaissance collection, which is one of our more remarkable collections that we're actively building right now. So potentially very soon, you might just be able to see them in an exhibition space, but that's sort of in the future there. So I saw Earl is in the chat now and has been adding things there. So hopefully that helps there. Daniel, what is your favorite books in T&S collection? Anything Irish in keeping with your own scholarly interests? Yeah, we have. So this is actually a question earlier. I forgot that this book was actively acquired on T&S funds until right now. So thanks for that, Earl. We have a pamphlet from the Desmond Rebellion, which is one of the sort of lesser, I don't want to say cared about, but lesser thought about rebellions in the 17th century in Ireland, basically because it's after Hugh O'Neill's sort of great final rebellion that ends with sort of what's known as the Flight of the Earls under the Culloden at sort of the end of the Gaelic order in Ireland. So it's a bit later. It's a bit the main Irish cause has since been kind of really squelched, so it's kind of ignored, but it's a really important document, not just for its accounting of the rebellion itself, but also because of its woodcut, which has this sort of a famous motif amongst a lot of English representations of the Irish, of the beheaded Irishman whose head is on a pike somewhere or piled up in someone's tent, right? There's many accounts of a English warlord going over and slaughtering people, cutting their heads off, and making their widows approach them, the heads all around, asking for mercy or food or what have you. So there's a really important woodcut of an Irishman's head outside of Dublin. I'm pretty sure it's Dublin. At least the woodcut is Dublin. I don't know exactly if they intended it to be Dublin, but I know that the woodcut itself on some of the walls of Dublin. So anyway, that's my favorite item, mostly because it's bizarre. It's kind of understudied, and I think it's very interesting. So that's. But I mean, otherwise, probably the prompt book. I mean, if I'm moving my own interest aside, that Hamlet prompt book is unbelievably, it's unbelievable that we have it, right, in a lot of ways. But I was part of the performance that put it on, and it's kind of interesting how successful it was at maintaining the spirit of Hamlet, but cutting it down to basically an hour and a half, which is kind of remarkable. We had Gregory Doran, the sort of emeritus director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, come in to look at our first folio, and I just talked with him about the prompt book, and he was also commenting how a lot of the excerpting that John Ward did, the cutting down of the play, actually maps on to a lot of later some shortenings of Hamlet, including some done by the Royal Shakespeare Company, even though nobody has ever really referenced Ward's cuttings, right? So there are places where basically everyone agrees Hamlet can be cut down. So it's also it's essentially an object. It's an interesting artifact. It's really interesting there. So between those are two of my favorite items, I would say. I'm also, for personal reasons, I'm not my own person, but this Marcus Aurelius with Sir William Osler's note at the end. There's something very powerful about it. So maybe there. Maybe that those three, if I can say three instead of one. So Paul asked, the T&S used to cultivate a linkage between the English department at Homewood with medical school. In fact, in the 60s and 70s, the annual president would exchange between the two. Will this be encouraged again? Yeah, it's part of our long-term desire with the club. It's something when I was with the society, again, I said in the video, I keep switching back and forth between the two. I'm going to keep doing the same here. When I first was talking with Earl, and we were talking about this plan to revitalize the club, which he had been thinking about and working with kind of for years before I arrived. But when my postdoc sort of was announced and concretized, it was understood that I would be a major part of the T&S's revitalization. So with that, what do you call it? I really wanted to make sure that we focused on the society as a social organization, but also as bridging parts of Hopkins. Right, Hopkins, it has sometimes a history of closing in on itself, of people doing really interesting, remarkable works in their own labs, in their own centers, in their own departments. But the T&S Society kind of has that potential to reach out. The big problem is that there's not been as much collaboration between the various schools of Hopkins over the years. It's just a sort of fact of the matter. There are faculty who are now really trying to overcome that, and I think there's a lot of space for it. Mary Fissel, sort of my big sort of person I go to, is doing that great work of bridging the medical side and the humanistic side. But absolutely, I mean, this is as we continue to really establish ourselves, and we are able to explain to people at the medical school, especially in the history of medicine, what we're doing. Right, it's sort of part of the long-term goals for sure. But yeah, absolutely, it's from the original sort of revitalization efforts that has been a major part of it, right? Something from the very beginning. Joe asked, right, besides the Elizabethan Society at Yale, are there other notable collegiate literature groups or Tudor and Stuart book collections? In the U.S., there's of course a large number of collections all throughout the U.S. I mean, it's one of the major libraries, and of course, most major private R1 institutions have some capacity of the some rare book holdings in and of themselves. But as far as clubs, institutions, societies go, that focus on the history of the book, that focus on the Tudor and Stuart period, not so much, right? A lot of that work has kind of gone outside of the individual universities into larger sort of larger organizations, the Renaissance Society of America, or maybe sort of Milton Studies section, right, where these organizing bodies that put out their own publications, that put out their own materials, that have their own conferences, et cetera, is where a lot of that sort of broadening collegiality has been put off to, right? So at Hopkins, not only is the T&S Society, but the Virginia Fox Stern Center, right, are both kind of remarkable institutions in and of themselves. They're remarkable sort of centers for this. And I'm sure there are people who would tut me if they were in the chat and sort of knew more about them. But really, other than the Elizabethan Club, it's the Elizabethan Club and the T&S Society at Hopkins that I really know and that come to mind. Now, someone might tell me later on, well, you forgot so-and-so place. Very good, very well. I'd forgotten that, but that's there. So moving on, so I'm going to do my reading of the chat again to make sure I'm really keeping up with this all as we keep going. So give me one moment. Jennifer. So you talked about the different endings of the Faerie Queene. How are the different? Yeah. So this. It's not ending to the Faerie. Right, the Faerie Queene itself never ends. Spenser kind of fails to complete it for a number of reasons. Not the least of which basically because he begins to go a bit mad, obsessing over the Irish, as he's a planter in Munster at the time. But the end of the third book of the Faerie, so the first publication of the Faerie Queene, right, this 1590 printing ends with the third book of the Faerie Queene, right? So here we go. Here we have the first three books of the Faerie Queene ending right there, right? And we continue on with this reprinting, right? I mean, there's another reprinting before this, but 1609, right, is another reprinting. The short of it is, and I don't want to get fully super in depth into this, the 1590 edition ended with a very sensual, amorous, corporeal, all those fun, sexy words, description of two lovers coming together, and it really is kind of body in a lot of ways, right? It ends in this sort of hermaphroditic blending of the two together to the point where they're kind of varied beings kind of become one. That was taken out. Those final, I believe, 4 quatrains. I might be off. There might be 3 quatrains. The 4 quatrains were removed and replaced with kind of a basic Brito Mart ending, right? This sort of, and thus we sort of end everything up. So that's basically how it ends. If you want to know more, if you want to read, I mean, you could find the 1590 ending and read it for yourself. Again, I don't. Maybe for censorship reasons. I guess it's not a body today, as we can. But I mean, just a random word here. Of huge affection did in pleasure melt, right? And that's just like one section from this quote, right? So you can get a sense of what was changing there. Right. So one last question. I will go here as we sort of begin to wrap up, and hopefully I didn't speak too quickly, mutter and stumble too much, become too annoying to listen to. But keeping track of the chat with books around and all those other things can sometimes be a little much. So I see this question from Joe, right? That you attended lectures in the 1970s. Is there a way to reconnect? Absolutely, right. I mean, so the Stern Center itself, which is where which is kind of the center that oversees the T&S Society in large ways, the center in the libraries. The Stern Center itself has its own lecture series, right? That for anyone interested, just generally in book history, and that sort of ranges, in subject matter and attention through basically every type of publication you might be interested in the early modern period. Now, for the T&S Society, we currently have an RSVP system, right? This is really meant to be a scholarly and collegiate organization at the same time, encouraging collaboration, right, between sort of interested parties and not sort of focusing the same type of general lecture. But if one's interested in it, it's a closed door but not a locked door, if that makes sense. So soon we'll launch the Stern Center website, and after that there will be a T&S Society landing page on that website where you can keep up with the events. So RSVPs are welcome. There's a reception afterwards after every sort of event that we do. You're more than welcome to keep up and keep track with that. You could have the Stern Center. There's a Stern Center email address as well that you can send, sterncenter@jhu.edu, if you want sort of more direct communication. But just look for those future announcements. And for a large part, the advertising of the club hasn't been as strong outside of our immediate demographics because it's our first year really coming back. And beyond that, we've doubled the Stern Center, if you include the T&S Society events, has doubled the amount of events that it's done this year. And there's still basically 2 people, including the fellow, who are not including fellows, running it, Earl Havens and myself. So there's also an issue of labor power behind it. So keep an eye out for the events in the future. Reach out. If anything seems interesting, you're more than welcome to RSVP and sort of come and enjoy the crack, as it were, the camaraderie. One final question here. I got another one as I was talking. What are the future goals of the society and leadership? For sure, continuing to try to bridge and make connections between other campuses and schools at Hopkins, right? The music school as well, I think, is another group that we'd like to see more collaboration with. I mean, there's the historical performance department there, and a few professors in the school who themselves are interested in earlier music and sort of the culture around it, not just its performance. The medical school, of course, and sort of continuing to encourage those connections. Beyond that, I think my future for the society is to make it stable, to stabilize it. I mean, I don't have much interest in locking down what the society must be. I'd rather just continue to the best of our ability this momentum of collegial camaraderie, social events that are also set around stable, rare book presentations. Several of the talks that have already been given are being turned into essays by graduate students submitting these articles for publication, right? That's what I want to see continue. I want the club, the society to continue. Whatever its form may be, beyond reaching out to anyone interested in the early modern period, beyond that impetus, what form it takes is less important to me than the fact that it takes some form, right? So with that, I think we hopefully can wrap up a little bit. If you see me around campus or you're around Baltimore at all, feel free to reach out to me. Closing remarks. We're going to wrap things up. I have my little cheat sheet here, make sure I don't forget anything. I'd like to thank you all, our live audience who turned in today to learn and ask questions. If you'd like to share a rewatch program, it will be made available on the Hopkins at Home website and the Johns Hopkins University YouTube page in the coming days. If you're interested in the T&S Society, keep an eye on the Stern Center website, which will be launching in the next few months. There's also an email address, sort of email the Stern Center if you have any questions in general, sterncenter@jhu.edu. With that, I'll end this up here. Thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Take it easy.